before we begin tonight's journey, if you enjoy these deep dives into history's darker corners, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories like this to fall asleep to, subscribe to the channel. Now, drop your city and the current time in the comments below. I love seeing where all of you are joining me from tonight. Alright, dim those lights, get comfortable under the covers, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background noise, and let's drift back together to a time and place that was nothing like the movies told you. Picture this. Dawn breaks over a dusty frontier settlement, somewhere in Montana Territory, 1884. The sun's just starting to peek over the mountains, casting long shadows across the rutted main street. There's a crowd gathering near the edge of town, maybe 30 or 40 people, some still rubbing sleep from their eyes. They're standing beneath a cottonwood tree, and hanging from one of its thick branches is the body of a man. He's swaying slightly in the morning breeze, a crude hand-lettered sign pinned to his chest. "Horse thief," it reads. Nothing more. No trial happened here. No judge presided over evidence. No jury deliberated his fate. In fact, there's no courthouse within 100 miles of this place. So here's the question that's going to keep us company for the next hour and a half. The question that unravels everything you thought you knew about the American frontier. Who decided this man should die? Who had the power to make that call? Was it the sheriff? The mayor? The good citizens acting in concert for the public good? The answer is going to surprise you. It's going to disturb you. And by the time we're done tonight, you're going to understand that everything the movies taught you about the Wild West, about frontier justice, about how these towns actually functioned, was a comfortable lie. A mythology carefully constructed to hide something far more chaotic, far more brutal, and far more revealing about human nature and power itself. Because here's the truth they don't tell you in the westerns. The frontier wasn't tamed by sheriffs with shiny badges and quick draws. It wasn't civilized by democratic town councils where everyone had their say. It wasn't ordered by the rule of law slowly spreading westward like morning light. No, the American frontier was ruled by whoever had the most money, the most guns, and the least hesitation about using both. And those people, the ones who really controlled these towns, they weren't the heroes you've been taught to celebrate. They were businessmen, criminals, corporate representatives, people who understood that in a place without law, power doesn't come from a badge. It comes from a ledger book. Tonight, we're going to pull back the curtain on frontier America and look at who really ran these towns. We're going to meet the saloon keepers who held more power than any elected official, the general store owners who used debt like a weapon, the vigilante committees that were really just businessmen protecting their investments, the sheriffs who were either too corrupt or too powerless to matter, and the invisible hands, the railroad barons and mining executives pulling strings from 1,000 miles away, deciding who lived and who died based on nothing more than profit margins. So settle in, let your breathing slow, let the day fall away, because we're about to step into a world where justice was just another word for leverage, where law meant whatever the richest man in town said it meant, and where the only real crime was being poor and powerless. Welcome to the real Wild West, the one they didn't show you in the movies. Let's start with what you think you know. Close your eyes for a moment and picture the Wild West. What do you see? Probably something like this. A dusty main street, wooden buildings with false fronts, hitching posts lined with horses. And there, standing in front of the sheriff's office, a lawman with a tin star pinned to his chest, a six-shooter on his hip, steady hands and steely eyes. He's the line between chaos and civilization. When trouble rides into town, he faces it down. Maybe there's a climactic showdown at high noon. The bad guys fall, the good guys prevail. Order is restored. Roll credits. That's the frontier we know. The frontier of John Wayne and Clint Eastwood. The frontier of Gunsmoke and the Lone Ranger. The frontier where brave lawmen upheld justice against overwhelming odds, where democratic principles slowly civilized the wild territories, where good ultimately triumphed over evil through courage and moral clarity. It's a beautiful story, inspiring even. There's just one problem with it. Almost none of it is true. The mythology of the American West is one of the most successful propaganda campaigns in human history. It started even before the frontier was fully settled. Dime novels in the 1870s and 1880s were already spinning yarns about heroic sheriffs and noble outlaws, publishing sensationalized accounts of gunfights that never happened, creating legends out of men who were at best complicated and at worst outright criminals. Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows turned frontier life into entertainment, complete with staged bank robberies and choreographed shootouts. Then came the movies, cementing the mythology into American culture so deeply that even now, more than a century later, we can't seem to shake it loose. The problem is, when you actually dig into the historical record, when you read the newspapers from these frontier towns, when you look at court documents and personal letters and financial records, a very different picture emerges. And it's not a pretty one. Let's talk about those legendary lawmen for a minute. Wyatt Earp, Wild Bill Hickok, Bat Masterson, names that still resonate with authority and heroism. But look closer at their actual lives, and the mythology starts to crumble. Wyatt Earp spent more time as a gambler, saloon, owner, and pimp than he ever did as a lawman. His brief stint as assistant marshal in Dodge City was marked more by his business dealings than by any notable law enforcement. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral? It lasted maybe 30 seconds, probably wasn't even legal, and had more to do with personal vendettas and business disputes than anything resembling justice. Wild Bill Hickok's law enforcement career was even shorter. He served as Marshal of Abilene, Kansas for less than a year. During that time, he accidentally shot and killed his own deputy. The town council, perhaps understandably, decided not to renew his contract. He spent most of his life as a professional gambler, and he was eventually shot in the back while playing cards in a Deadwood saloon. Not exactly the stuff of legend. Or rather, not the legend we were sold. Bat Masterson, businessman first, lawman distant second. He understood early on that real power in frontier towns didn't come from wearing a badge. It came from owning the places where people spent their money and lost their wages. He ran saloons and gambling operations. The sheriff's badge was just a useful tool for protecting his business interests. And here's the thing that really unravels the mythology. Most frontier towns went years without any official law enforcement at all. None. Zero. When a settlement first sprang up, maybe around a railroad stop or a new gold strike, there was no sheriff, no marshal, no courts, no jails, just people, chaos, and whatever rough justice they could improvise in the moment. The famous cattle towns of Kansas, places like Dodge City and Abilene, they didn't establish official law enforcement until they'd already been operating for months or even years. And even then, the position was so dangerous, so poorly paid, and so politically fraught that the tenure of most sheriffs could be measured in weeks or months, not years. The real statistics are sobering. In many frontier counties, the sheriff's position turned over constantly. Men would serve briefly, either because they were voted out, ran out of town, or ended up dead. The death rate among frontier lawmen was extraordinarily high, but not because they were gunned down by outlaws in dramatic shootouts. More often, they were ambushed, shot in the back, or simply disappeared, victims of the same chaotic violence that plagued everyone else. And the pay. Oh, the pay. Most frontier sheriffs weren't paid a salary at all. They were compensated through a percentage of the taxes they collected, which created a perverse incentive system. A sheriff's income depended on how much money he could extract from the community, not on how well he kept the peace. Some sheriffs supplemented their income by running businesses on the side, businesses that often competed with or preyed upon the very people they were supposed to protect. Others simply took bribes, looking the other way when the right people asked them to, and cracking down harshly when it served their financial interests. This is what Hollywood didn't show you. The frontier wasn't tamed by heroic lawmen standing up for justice. Those men were either too few, too corrupt, or too dead to matter much. So if badges didn't bring order, what did? Or rather, who did? That's the question we're really here to explore tonight. Because power didn't disappear in the absence of official law. It just took different forms, more primal forms. Forms that reveal uncomfortable truths about what happens when you strip away the thin veneer of legal authority and let human nature operate in its rawest state. The frontier wasn't lawless. Not exactly. It had law. Just not the kind you'd recognize from civics class. It was the law of whoever could seize power and hold it, the law of money, the law of violence, the law of whoever owned the places where people gathered, where they spent their money, where they got drunk and made bad decisions. So before we meet the real rulers of the frontier, let's understand how these towns even came to exist in the first place, because the way a town was born often determined who would control it for years to come. Picture the Great Plains in the 1860s or 1870s. Vast emptiness, grass stretching to the horizon, maybe some buffalo in the distance, a few Native American tribes still trying to hold on to their traditional lands, though that's a whole other dark story we won't fully dive into tonight. Then something changes. Maybe a railroad company decides to lay track through this particular valley. Maybe a prospector finds colour in a nearby creek, and word starts to spread. Maybe the army establishes a fort to protect settlers, and merchants realise there's money to be made supplying soldiers. Whatever the catalyst, people start arriving. Not families at first, not respectable settlers looking to build homes and plant crops. No, the first wave is almost always the same demographic. Young men, drifters, speculators, con artists, people looking to get rich quick or at least survive another season. People running from something back east. People with no ties, no roots, no particular attachment to law or order. They come with money in their pockets if they're lucky, desperation in their bellies if they're not, and always, always a willingness to take risks that would make more settled folks blanch. The first structures that go up are telling. It's not a church, it's not a school, it's not a courthouse. The very first building in almost every frontier town is either a tent saloon or a general store. Sometimes both go up simultaneously, the owners eyeing each other warily, already calculating how to outmaneuver the competition. These aren't elaborate buildings. We're talking about canvas tents, maybe with some rough-hewn lumber if there's a sawmill nearby, dirt floors, crude furniture cobbled together from shipping crates. But they serve their purpose. The saloon is where men gather to drink away the exhaustion and fear that comes from living on the edge of nowhere. The general store is where they buy the supplies they need to keep not dying. Flour, coffee, picks, shovels, rope, ammunition. The essentials of frontier survival, all priced at whatever the market will bear, which in a monopoly situation is usually everything you have. Let's pause there for a moment and really picture what these early settlements looked like, because this is important for understanding the power dynamics we're about to explore. Imagine you've just arrived in one of these brand new towns. Maybe it's a railroad camp in Wyoming. Maybe it's a gold rush settlement in Colorado. Maybe it's a cattle stop in Kansas. The specifics don't matter much, because they all followed the same basic pattern. You step off a dusty stagecoach or climb down from your horse after days of hard riding. Your clothes are stiff with sweat and dirt. Your throat is raw from dust. Your eyes are gritty and red. The first thing that hits you is the smell. Wood smoke, yes, but also horse manure, human waste, the sickly sweet odour of a rotting garbage, the sharp tang of unwashed bodies. Sanitation isn't even a concept yet. People just throw their refuse into the street. The whole place smells like one enormous latrine with pretensions. The main street, if you can even call it that, is just a muddy track churned up by wagon wheels and hundreds of boots. When it rains, it becomes a swamp. When it's dry, the dust is so thick you can barely see from one end to the other. Buildings, such as they are, line both sides. Most are just wooden frames with canvas stretched over them. A few might have actual plank walls, but that's a sign of relative prosperity. Everything looks temporary because it is. Half these towns will be abandoned within a year or two. Nobody's investing in permanence yet. There's no grid pattern, no organised layout. Buildings went up wherever someone could claim a piece of ground and defend it. Sometimes that meant building right next to a competitor just to spite them. Sometimes it meant staking a claim to the best location, the corner lot where two trails met, and daring anyone to challenge you for it. Property rights were whatever you could enforce with your fists or your guns. The population is overwhelmingly male, maybe 90% or more. Young men, mostly in their 20s and 30s, though you see older faces too. Hard faces, desperate faces. Faces that have seen things and done things that don't leave pleasant memories. Everyone's armed. Not in the Hollywood way where the hero has a single pistol in a tied-down holster. No, people carry whatever weapons they can get their hands on. Old military rifles from the Civil War, shotguns, derringers tucked into boot tops, knives, brass knuckles, anything that might make the difference between walking away from a confrontation and bleeding out in the mud. And the noise. God, the noise. Hammering as new structures go up, shouting as men argue over claims or card games or women. Somewhere, a piano is being played badly in one of the saloons, probably by someone too drunk to remember the melody. Gunshots crack out periodically, sometimes just men firing into the air out of high spirits or boredom, sometimes something more serious. Dogs bark, horses whinny, wagon wheels creak. It's a cacophony of chaos, the sound of civilization trying to establish itself in a place where nobody really wants to follow civilization's rules. This is the environment where power takes shape, and in this environment, the people who seize power first aren't elected officials or appointed lawmen. They're the people who own the places where money changes hands. They're entrepreneurs, but not the kind you learn about in business school. They're predators who understood one simple truth. In a world where everyone needs something, the person who controls the supply has all the leverage in the world. Let's meet them, these frontier kingpins who never made it into the Hollywood versions. Let's start with the most powerful of all, the rulers of the early West who wielded more influence than any sheriff or mayor ever could. Let's talk about the saloon keepers. You're standing on that muddy main street as the sun starts to set. The temperature drops fast out here, the desert cold moving in to replace the blistering heat of the day. Men are finishing their work, whatever that work might be. Miners stumbling back from the diggings, hands raw and bloody, backs screaming from a day bent over a sluice box. Cowboys riding in from the range, saddle sore and dusty. Railroad workers whose muscles ache from laying track under the merciless sun. Gamblers emerging from wherever they spent the daylight hours, ready for another night of cards. And they're all heading the same direction. The saloon. The saloon's doors are already open wide, yellow lamplight spilling out into the gathering darkness. That light is welcoming after the harshness of the day, promising warmth and comfort, and a few hours where maybe you can forget how precarious your existence really is. You follow the crowd inside, and this is where the real West happened. Not in melodramatic shootouts, not in courtrooms dispensing justice. Here, in a room that smells like spilled beer, tobacco smoke, and desperate men. Look around this room with fresh eyes, because we need to understand what the saloon really was in a frontier town. It's not just a bar. It's the beating heart of the entire community. The long wooden bar stretches along one wall, scarred and stained, presided over by a bartender who's probably armed and definitely watching everything that happens. Behind him, shelves of bottles, most of them locally made rock gut that barely qualifies as whiskey, but serves the purpose of getting men drunk quickly and cheaply. A few fancier bottles for those who can afford them, or want to put on airs. Tables are scattered across the floor, most of them occupied by card games at various stages. Poker, faro, monte, whatever games chance men's luck and their money. Professional gamblers work these tables moving from one to another, their fingers quick and their eyes quicker. Some of them work for the house. Some are independent operators paying a percentage to the saloon owner for the privilege of fleecing his customers. Either way, money flows constantly, from pockets to tables to the house, always to the house eventually. In the back corner, there might be a piano. If you're lucky, the player is sober enough to hit most of the right notes. Music drifts through the smoke and noise, giving the whole scene a surreal quality. Sometimes there's a small stage where performers, usually women, might sing or dance. We'll come back to those women later, because they played their own complicated role in frontier power dynamics. Stairs lead up to a second floor. Those rooms upstairs serve various purposes. Some are for card games that need more privacy. Some are where whispered business deals happen, where land claims change hands, where men make agreements they can't put on paper. And yes, some are where prostitutes take their customers, though the nature of that business varied wildly from place to place. Sometimes the saloon and the brothel were completely separate operations. Sometimes they were deeply intertwined, with the same owner controlling both. The walls are decorated, if you can call it that, with whatever the owner could scrounge. Paintings, usually of naked women or pastoral scenes, that seem absurdly out of place in this environment. Wanted posters, often as decoration more than information. Maybe a mirror behind the bar if the owner could afford one. The floor is wood planks where it's anything at all covered in sawdust to soak up the spilled beer and blood and worse. Spittoons dot the room, though plenty of men just spit on the floor. The whole place is filthy by any modern standard, but out here it passes for luxury. This is the court of the Saloon King, and make no mistake, he is a king, or at least a feudal lord, wielding power that would make elected officials back east envious. Who were these men who ran the saloons? Let's build a composite picture, because while each one was different, they tended to share certain characteristics. Most of them were from back east originally, or from Europe. They'd come west for the same reasons as everyone else, looking for opportunity they couldn't find in more settled places. Maybe they'd been bartenders in New York or Chicago. Maybe they'd run smaller establishments and saw the chance to build something bigger. Maybe they were just sharp-eyed businessmen who recognized that in a place full of lonely, bored, frightened men with cash in their pockets, there was gold to be made that didn't require a pick and shovel. They arrived early, usually in that first wave of settlers. They staked their claims to the best locations, the spots where foot traffic would naturally congregate, and they built their empires out of canvas and wood, alcohol and cards, and an acute understanding of human weakness. These weren't stupid men. They couldn't afford to be. Running a frontier saloon required skills most modern business owners would recognize. You needed to manage inventory in a place where supply chains were uncertain at best. You needed to handle money, which meant keeping ledgers and tracking credit. You needed to manage staff, the bartenders and gamblers and women who worked for you, keeping them loyal or at least compliant. You needed to maintain security in a room full of armed, drunk men who might decide at any moment that violence was a reasonable response to losing at cards. And perhaps most importantly, you needed to navigate the complex web of relationships that determined survival in a frontier town. Because here's what made the saloon keeper powerful: knowledge. He knew everyone who came through his doors. He knew who owed money and to whom. He knew who was planning to leave town and who just arrived. He knew about affairs, both romantic and business. He knew which miners had struck it rich and which ones were going broke. He knew the gossip, the secrets, the whispered plans. Men talked when they drank, and the saloon keeper listened. But more than that, he knew how to use what he knew. Credit was the key. Very few men had enough cash to pay for everything up front. So the saloon kept a running tab. You could drink tonight and pay next week when you got paid. You could join the card game and settle your losses later. This was necessary, of course. Men needed some way to get by between paydays. But it also meant that the saloon keeper owned you, just a little bit. Your debt gave him leverage, and he used that leverage in ways both subtle and overt. Maybe he'd forgive your tab if you voted the right way in the next election. Maybe he'd call in your debt if you crossed him or one of his allies. Maybe he'd accept payment in forms other than cash: information, labor, muscle. Whatever he needed at the moment. The saloon keeper was a banker, but he dealt in favors and obligations as much as dollars. Let's look at a specific example because this illustrates how power really worked. Meet Charlie Norton, a real saloon owner in a Colorado mining town in the 1870s. His establishment, the Golden Eagle, was the first permanent building in a settlement that sprang up when gold was discovered in a nearby creek. Norton arrived before the miners, actually, having gotten word early about the strike. He hired local workers to put up a structure that was halfway decent, with real wood walls and a stone fireplace. By the time the first wave of prospectors arrived, exhausted from their journey and desperate for a drink, Norton was ready to take their money. Within 6 months, Norton owned half the town, literally. He'd accepted land claims as payment for debts. He'd financed other businesses, taking ownership stakes in return. He ran the biggest poker games and controlled most of the prostitution, and he'd cultivated relationships with the most dangerous men in town, hiring them as bouncers or security, keeping them loyal with free drinks and a share of the profits. When disputes arose, which they did constantly, people came to Norton to settle them, not to any official authority, because none existed, to Norton, in his saloon, over drinks that he poured. Norton's power was vast, but also precarious. He had to constantly balance competing interests. The miners wanted cheap whiskey and fair card games. though defining fair was always tricky. His gamblers wanted to make money, which sometimes meant cheating, but not so blatantly that it provoked violence. His security men wanted to be paid, and they weren't shy about using force to get what they thought they deserved. Local merchants envied his success and looked for ways to undermine him, and looming over everything was the constant threat that the gold would run out, the miners would leave, and his empire would vanish overnight. So Norton did what any smart power broker would do. He diversified. He opened a second saloon. He bought shares in a local mine. He financed a freight business, taking a cut of everything hauled in or out of town. He formed alliances with other businessmen, creating an informal consortium that controlled much of the town's economy. When a sheriff was finally appointed, Norton made sure the man understood who really called the shots. The badge was just for show. Real authority rested with the men who owned the town's economy, and Norton was first among them. But Norton's story doesn't end happily. It rarely did for these frontier power brokers. In 1878, a fire swept through the town, started accidentally, or maybe not. Norton's saloon burned to the ground. He lost most of his assets in a single night. He tried to rebuild, but by then competition had moved in. Newer saloons with younger owners who'd learned from Norton's example. The town itself was changing too. The easy gold was gone, and miners were leaving. Norton ended up dying, broke in a boarding house in Denver 3 years later, his brief reign as frontier king forgotten by almost everyone. This was the pattern. Power was immense but temporary. The men who seized it early often lost it just as quickly, victims of fire or violence or shifting economics. But while they had it, while they sat at their tables in the back of their saloons, settling disputes and making deals, they were more powerful than any elected official. They were the true government of the frontier, administering a kind of liquid justice dispensed one shot glass at a time. The saloon served another critical function that made its owner powerful. It was the town's primary gathering place, which meant it functioned as a de facto town hall. When important decisions needed to be made, where did people meet? The saloon. When elections were held, where did voting often take place? The saloon. When news arrived from outside, where did it get shared first? The saloon. The physical space itself became synonymous with public life, and whoever controlled that space had their thumb on the scale of every decision. There's a darker side to this power that we need to acknowledge. The saloon was also where violence incubated. Drunk men with weapons, gambling losses that felt like personal insults, old grudges that hadn't been forgotten, romantic rivalries, business disputes. All of it mixed together in an atmosphere of hair-trigger tension. Fights broke out constantly. Sometimes they were just drunken brawls that ended with black eyes and bruised ribs. Sometimes they escalated into shootings or stabbings that left men dead on the sawdust-covered floor. The saloon keeper had to manage this violence carefully. Too much of it, and people would stop coming. His business would suffer. But too little enforcement, too heavy a hand, and he'd be seen as a tyrant. Men didn't come west to be told what to do. They came for freedom, even if that freedom meant the freedom to get killed over a bad poker hand. So the saloon keeper walked a tightrope, allowing enough violence to maintain the frontier's dangerous mystique, while preventing it from spiraling into complete chaos. And sometimes the saloon keeper used violence deliberately. Competitors who threatened his monopoly might find their establishments mysteriously burned. Men who caused too much trouble might be beaten and run out of town. Debtors who couldn't or wouldn't pay might simply disappear, their bodies found days later in a ravine outside town, if they were found at all. The saloon keeper didn't usually do this work himself. That's what hired muscle was for. But everyone understood where the orders came from. This was power, in its rawest form. Not the power of legal authority or democratic legitimacy. The power of control over resources people needed, the ability to extend or deny credit, the willingness to use violence when other methods failed, and perhaps most importantly, the power of information and connection. The saloon keeper knew everyone, and everyone knew him. He was the spider at the center of a web that connected every part of frontier society. Cross him at your peril. Now, the saloon keeper wasn't the only businessman wielding this kind of power. There was another figure, equally important but often overlooked, who controlled a different choke point in the frontier economy. While the saloon keeper provided what men wanted, this other man provided what they needed, and that distinction made all the difference. Let's meet the general store owner. The general store in a frontier town occupied a unique position. Unlike the saloon, which catered to vice and entertainment, the general store dealt in survival. Food, tools, clothing, medicine, ammunition, all the things that kept people alive in a harsh environment where a broken shovel or a shortage of flour could mean the difference between making it through the winter and starving to death. This gave the store owner a different kind of power than the saloon keeper, but no less absolute. If the saloon keeper ruled men's vices, the store owner ruled their necessities, and he used that power with ruthless efficiency. Picture the frontier general store. It's a larger building than most in town because it needs to be. Shelves line the walls from floor to ceiling, stocked with whatever goods the owner managed to freight in from the nearest railroad or river port. Sacks of flour and cornmeal are piled in the corners. Barrels of salt pork and pickled vegetables sit on the floor. Tools hang from the rafters, picks and shovels and hammers and saws. Bolts of cloth are displayed on a counter. Canned goods, still relatively new technology, are premium items kept behind the counter where the owner can control access. There's usually a section of the store devoted to mining equipment if you're in gold country, or ranching supplies if you're in cattle country. Ropes, harnesses, saddles, branding irons, all the specialized equipment required for whatever industry keeps the town alive. And always, prominently displayed, ammunition and sometimes firearms themselves, though most men arrived with their own weapons. The smell is distinctive, a mix of coffee, leather, tobacco, and the faint rot of produce that didn't survive the long journey. Everything's covered in a thin layer of dust, because frontier towns are dusty places, and there's no keeping it out. The proprietor stands behind a wooden counter, often with a pistol within easy reach, and he watches everyone who enters with the calculating eye of a man who's learned not to trust easily. Like the saloon keeper, the general store owner arrived early and staked his claim to a good location. But unlike the saloon keeper, whose investment was relatively modest, a tent and some bottles of whiskey, the store owner needed capital. He needed to pay for goods to stock his shelves. He needed to arrange freight, which was expensive and uncertain. He needed to construct a building secure enough to protect his inventory. This meant that general store owners tended to come from slightly more established backgrounds. They had money already, or backers with money. They were serious businessmen, not frontier drifters trying their luck, and they understood something fundamental about monopoly power. In a frontier town, especially in those early months or years, there was often only one general store. Building a second store required capital most people didn't have, and even if you could scrape together the money, competing with an established store was nearly impossible. The first store owner had already negotiated deals with freight companies. He had established supply lines. He had credit relationships with suppliers back east. He knew which goods moved and which didn't. A newcomer starting from scratch faced almost insurmountable odds. This monopoly position allowed for pricing practices that would be illegal in more settled places, though there were no laws against it on the frontier. Price gouging was standard business practice. That sack of flour that cost $3 in Kansas City, it might sell for $15 in a remote Colorado mining camp, and the store owner would justify it by pointing to the freight costs, the risk of spoilage, the uncertainty of supply. All true, to a point. But the margins were still astronomical, and everyone knew it. You paid what the store owner demanded, or you went without. But here's where the store owner's power really manifested. Credit. Just like at the saloon, almost no one had enough cash to pay for everything up front. So the store owner maintained accounts, ledgers where he tracked what each customer owed. He'd extend credit based on his assessment of your ability to pay. Miners who seemed to be working a promising claim might get generous credit. Drifters with no visible means of support got nothing. And once you were in debt to the store owner, you were trapped in a system that resembled feudalism more than capitalism. The terms of credit were always in the store owner's favor. Interest was charged, sometimes explicitly, sometimes just through inflated prices for credit purchases. Payment was expected when ore came out of the ground or when cattle sold, but if those events didn't happen, the debt just kept growing. and the store owner had ways of calling in debts that had nothing to do with courts or legal proceedings. He controlled your access to necessities. Fall too far behind and suddenly you can't buy food, can't buy tools, can't buy ammunition. In a place where survival depends on having the right equipment and enough supplies, the store owner had the power of life and death. Not metaphorically, literally. Let's look at a specific example that illustrates how this system worked in practice. Consider Samuel Bridger, a general store owner in a Wyoming Territory settlement in the 1870s. Bridger's store was the only source of supplies for 30 miles in any direction. He'd set up shop at a crossroads where several ranches sent their cattle to market, and he served the ranchers, their cowhands, and the small community of farmers and tradespeople who'd settled in the area. Bridger kept meticulous records. In his ledgers, which still survive, you can see the web of debt that entangled nearly every family in the region. The McAllister Ranch owed him $847 for supplies purchased over the course of 2 years. The Johnsons, a farming family, owed $312. The widow Carpenter owed $89, a sum she'd been trying to pay off for 3 years. Individual cowboys and drifters owed smaller amounts, $5 here, $20 there, but those debts still mattered to men who earned maybe $1 a day when they could find work. Bridger used these debts as leverage. When the local community tried to organize an election for a town council, Bridger let it be known that he expected his debtors to vote for candidates he approved. Not directly, of course. That would have been too crude. But word spread through the informal networks that governed frontier life. Vote the right way, and maybe Bridger would be patient about that outstanding bill. Vote the wrong way, and maybe payment would be demanded immediately. Most people got the message. Bridger also used debt to acquire land. When the McAllister Ranch fell on hard times, hit by a brutal winter that killed half their herd, they couldn't pay their bill. Bridger offered a solution. Sign over a portion of your land and the debt disappears. The McAllisters had no choice. The land was worth far more than the debt, but without credit at the store, they couldn't survive long enough to sell it. They signed. Bridger ended up owning some of the best grazing land in the territory, acquired not through purchase but through the slow accumulation of unpayable debts. But Bridger's story, like Norton's, has a dark twist. In 1882, tensions in the territory came to a head. There had been disputes over water rights, over land claims, over who really owned what. These disputes often traced back to Bridger's debt-based land acquisitions. Some of the ranchers, the ones who'd been squeezed hardest, started organizing. They wanted to break Bridger's monopoly, maybe bring in a competing store or force him to lower prices. Bridger responded by calling in debts. Pay up, he demanded, or face consequences. One night, the widow Carpenter's barn burned down. It might have been an accident. Fire was always a risk in a place where people used open flames for light and heat. But people noticed that the widow had been one of the most vocal critics of Bridger's business practices. They noticed that Bridger's store employed several rough men whose job descriptions were deliberately vague. They noticed and they started to be afraid. But fear cuts both ways. The ranchers who'd been organizing didn't back down. Instead, they escalated. A group of masked men rode to Bridger's store one night and left him a message, nailed to his door. It detailed what would happen to him if he didn't forgive certain debts and lower his prices. The message was explicit and violent. Bridger had two choices, comply or fight. He chose to fight. The result was something between a range war and a community uprising. Violence flared for several months. Men were beaten. Property was destroyed. One of Bridger's employees was found dead, shot in what was ruled a hunting accident, though everyone knew better. Eventually exhausted and facing the real possibility of being killed, Bridger sold his store and left the territory. He moved back east, taking his wealth with him. The community he left behind was impoverished, traumatized, and deeply suspicious of anyone who tried to establish similar control. This pattern played out across the frontier in different variations. Store owners who wielded too much power eventually faced resistance, sometimes organized, sometimes violent, always rooted in the fundamental resentment people feel toward those who profit from their basic needs. But while the store owner's reign lasted, his power was immense and unchallengeable through any legal mechanism, because legal mechanisms barely existed. The store owner and the saloon keeper often formed the core of what passed for local government in these early frontier settlements. They had the most capital, the most connections, the most to lose if chaos spiraled out of control. So they'd meet, usually in one of their establishments, and they'd make decisions. Where should the town build a well? Their businesses need water, so yes, a well makes sense. Should the town try to attract a doctor? Sure, as long as he sets up practice in a building they own. Should there be any restrictions on violence? Well, not too many restrictions, because that would be bad for the frontier's reputation and might discourage the kind of men who keep money flowing through the economy. But maybe some basic rules about where and when gunplay was acceptable. These informal councils had no official standing. They weren't elected. They didn't represent anyone but themselves. But they were the closest thing to government that existed, and their decisions shaped the early development of frontier communities in ways that lasted long after official structures were finally established. The locations they chose for wells or roads, the land they claimed for their own, the types of businesses they encouraged or discouraged, all of it created patterns that persisted. And hovering around these business barons, drawn by the scent of wealth and weakness, was another group that would come to define frontier power dynamics. Groups of men who didn't own businesses but understood that violence, properly organized and directed, was its own form of capital. Men who saw themselves as enforcers of community values, but were really just protecting property and privilege. Let's talk about the vigilante committees. The word vigilante has romantic connotations now. We think of Clint Eastwood dispensing rough justice, Shane defending the homesteaders, noble citizens standing up against outlaw depredations when official law can't or won't act. But the reality of vigilante justice in the American West was far removed from these Hollywood fantasies. Vigilante committees were, almost without exception, organized and led by the wealthy elite of a community to protect their economic interests. They were lynch mobs with better publicity. Let's understand how vigilante committees actually formed. The catalyst was almost always property crime, a series of thefts maybe, horses stolen from wealthy ranchers, goods disappearing from freight wagons, gold dust vanishing from miners' claims. The key detail, the crimes affected people with money and influence. When poor men were robbed or killed, that rarely sparked vigilante organization. But when the theft threatened the profits of the business class, suddenly justice became urgent. The formation of a committee followed a predictable pattern. A few prominent men would call a meeting. The saloon owner, the general store owner, maybe a successful rancher or mine owner. They'd gather other business owners, men who had something to lose. Together, they'd draft articles of organization, rules that gave their group an official-sounding structure. They'd elect officers, a president and vice president and secretary. Everything designed to make the group seem legitimate, democratic even. But look at who had voting rights, who got to participate, and you'd see it was an exclusive club. The poor, the drifters, the men who lived on the margins, they weren't invited. The committee would then identify targets. This is where things got dark quickly. They weren't identifying people through careful investigation or accumulation of evidence. They were identifying people through rumor, suspicion, and often pre-existing prejudice. That new guy in town, the one who doesn't seem to have steady work, suspicious. That Chinese merchant who undercut prices at the general store, he must be involved somehow. That former Confederate who still wears his grey coat, can't trust him. The Mexican family whose land claim overlaps with a rancher's expansion plans, they're probably thieves. Once targets were identified, the committee moved fast. Speed was part of the point. Don't give the accused time to flee. Don't give them time to organize a defense. Don't give the community time to think too hard about what's happening. Strike at night when you can operate with relative secrecy. Gather your men, maybe a dozen or 2 dozen strong, all armed. Ride to where your target is sleeping. Drag him from his bed. His family watches, terrified, as masked men bind his hands and throw him on a horse. The trial that followed was theatre, nothing more. The committee would gather in some prearranged location, often still under cover of darkness. The accused would be brought forward. Charges would be read, usually by whoever could read in the group. Evidence would be presented, which really just meant people saying what they'd heard or suspected. The accused might be allowed to speak in his defense, but what could he say? He was bound, outnumbered, facing men whose decision was already made. Their verdict was written before the trial began. Guilty? always guilty, because innocent men don't get dragged from their beds by vigilantes. The existence of the trial proved the guilt. Circular logic, but it served its purpose, giving a veneer of legitimacy to what was about to happen. Then came the execution. Hanging was preferred because it was dramatic and final. A rope over a tree branch. The accused forced onto a horse, the rope placed around his neck. Maybe a moment for last words, though those rarely changed anything. Then the horse was spooked or pulled away, and the man dropped, the rope snapping taut, his body convulsing as he strangled to death. It took several minutes often, not the quick neck snap you see in movies. Slow strangulation, the dying man's legs kicking, his face purpling, his tongue protruding. The vigilantes watched. Sometimes the whole community watched. Children were there, learning what justice meant in this place. The body would be left hanging for a while, a message to anyone else considering a theft or resistance. Eventually it would be cut down and buried, often in an unmarked grave. Sometimes a note would be attached to the corpse or left at the site. Horse thief. Claimed jumper. Road agent. The crimes that warranted death, at least in the eyes of the committee. Now, here's what's crucial to understand about these vigilante committees. They weren't protecting the common good. They were protecting specific interests. The horses that got stolen belonged to wealthy ranchers. The gold that went missing belonged to successful miners or freight companies. The goods that disappeared from freight wagons belonged to merchants who'd paid for them. Poor men's property was never important enough to warrant vigilante action. When a drifter got robbed or a poor miner's claim was jumped, the vigilantes didn't ride. But when someone with influence lost something, the committee mobilized immediately. And sometimes, often actually, vigilante justice had nothing to do with actual crime. It was about eliminating competition, or settling personal grudges, or driving away people who didn't fit. Chinese immigrants were frequent targets of vigilante violence, not because they were criminals, but because their willingness to work for lower wages and live more frugally threatened white workers. Mexicans and Mexican Americans, especially those with land claims dating back to when the territory was Mexican, found themselves accused of crimes that justified stripping them of their property. Black cowboys and settlers faced vigilante violence for the crime of existing in spaces where white power brokers wanted them gone. The most famous vigilante committee, the San Francisco Committee of Vigilance in 1851, illustrates all these dynamics perfectly. San Francisco was booming during the gold rush, growing from a few hundred people to tens of thousands in just a couple of years. The city, if you could call it that, was overwhelmed. Crime was rampant. Theft, assault, murder. The official law enforcement was corrupt and ineffective. So a group of prominent businessmen, merchants and property owners formed the committee. They claimed noble intentions. They were just trying to bring order to chaos. But look at who they targeted and why. Their first victim was a man accused of theft, though the evidence was thin. He was hanged within hours of his capture. No real trial, no time for the accused to mount any defense. The committee went on to hang several more men, deport others, and terrify the city's working-class population into compliance. But did crime actually decrease? The historical record is mixed. What's clear is that the business elite consolidated power, driving out political opponents and labor organizers under the guise of fighting crime. The Montana Vigilantes provide another stark example. In 1863 and 1864, a vigilance committee formed in the gold camps around Bannock and Virginia City. They claimed to be fighting a gang of road agents who were robbing gold shipments. Their investigation led them to an astonishing conclusion. The leader of this gang was Henry Plummer, the elected sheriff. Plummer was arrested, given a brief trial by the Vigilante Committee, and hanged along with several of his deputies and alleged gang members. In total, the Montana Vigilantes executed somewhere between 20 and over 30 men in the span of a few weeks. Here's the thing, though. Modern historians have serious doubts about whether Plummer was actually guilty. The evidence against him was largely circumstantial and came from people who stood to benefit from his removal. Plummer had enemies among the business community because he tried to rein in some of their more predatory practices. He'd challenged the monopoly of certain merchants. He'd suggested that maybe some of the miners deserved better treatment. These aren't actions of a criminal mastermind. They're actions of someone who threatened the established power structure. but the vigilante's story was the one that stuck. Plumber became the archetype of the corrupt frontier lawman, and the vigilantes became heroes who cleaned up a lawless territory. The truth, which is that wealthy men used organized violence to eliminate someone who challenged their authority, was buried under the mythology, and that mythology served its purpose, legitimizing vigilante violence for decades to come. The committees often formalized their power in disturbing ways. They'd draft constitutions, complete with preambles about protecting life and property. They'd create symbols, sometimes wearing ribbons or badges to identify members. They'd hold public meetings where they'd explain their actions to the community, seeking post facto approval for their lynchings. And communities often did approve, at least publicly, because who wanted to be the next target? The psychological impact of vigilante justice on a community can't be overstated. It created an atmosphere of terror and paranoia. Anyone could be accused. Anyone could be dragged from their bed in the middle of the night. There was no appeal, no higher authority to petition. If the committee decided you were guilty, you were guilty. And even if you survived their initial wave of violence, you lived knowing that another wave could come at any time, for any reason or no reason at all. Some historians argue that vigilante committees were necessary, that they filled a genuine vacuum in law enforcement and prevented total chaos. And yes, there's some truth to that. In the absence of any legitimate legal authority, communities did need some way to address genuine threats. But the problem with vigilante justice is that it always becomes a tool of oppression. The people with power use it to maintain and expand that power. The powerless become targets, and violence, once normalized, escalates in ways nobody can control. By the time official law enforcement finally arrived in frontier communities, the pattern was set. Violence was an accepted tool of governance. Property rights trumped human rights. The wealthy made the rules and enforced them however they saw fit. And the mythology that justified all of it, the story of heroic citizens standing up against chaos, obscured the reality of mobs murdering people to protect business interests. That's the legacy of vigilante justice in the American West. Not heroism, terror, not order, tyranny. Now, eventually official law enforcement did arrive in most frontier communities. Territories appointed U.S. Marshals, counties elected sheriffs, towns hired marshals or constables. The trappings of legitimate government slowly spread westward, creating the appearance of law and order. But here's the question we need to ask. Did these official lawmen actually bring meaningful change to frontier power dynamics? Or were they just another tool for the existing power structure to maintain control? Let's find out by examining what it was really like to be a sheriff in the Wild West. And spoiler alert, it wasn't anything like the movies suggested. You've been elected sheriff. Congratulations! You've won a democratic election, which feels like a real accomplishment until you realize what comes next. The job you've just won is one of the most dangerous, underpaid, and politically fraught positions imaginable. You're going to be squeezed between competing interests, threatened by men who don't recognize your authority, and blamed for everything that goes wrong while getting credit for almost nothing that goes right. Your life expectancy just dropped significantly. But hey, at least you have a badge. First, let's talk about how you got elected, because this is important for understanding why sheriffs rarely challenge the existing power structure. Frontier elections were not the noble exercises in democracy you might imagine. Voting was restricted, often to property-owning men, which immediately excluded a large portion of the population. Voting itself was frequently done in public, with men declaring their choices out loud, which meant everyone knew who supported whom. Intimidation was common, bribes were common, vote buying was common, and the men who could afford to buy votes, who could organize supporters, who could promise favors or threaten consequences, those were the men who won elections. So you're sheriff now, but you probably got here with the support of the saloon keeper and the general store owner, and whoever else held economic power in town. Maybe they financed your campaign, such as it was. Maybe they convinced their employees and debtors to vote for you. Maybe they just made it clear that you were their candidate, and resistance would be expensive. Either way, you owe them. They own you, just like they own the drifters who owe them money, or the workers who depend on them for wages. You might have a badge, but you're not independent. You're an employee, and your employers are the business elite who actually run things. Your primary job the thing you'll spend most of your time doing isn't fighting outlaws or keeping the peace, it's collecting taxes. Frontier counties funded themselves through property taxes, and the sheriff was responsible for going around to every property owner, assessing what they owed and collecting it. This made you deeply unpopular with almost everyone, because nobody likes tax collectors. But here's the kicker. You were paid through a commission on what you collected. Typically, you'd keep a percentage, maybe 2 or 3% of the total. This meant your income depended on how effectively you could extract money from a community where most people were barely scraping by. The system created perverse incentives. You had motivation to assess high values on property, which made you even more unpopular. You had motivation to collect aggressively, even from people who genuinely couldn't afford to pay. And you had motivation to favour the wealthy, assessing their property at lower values in exchange for support or bribes, and making up the difference by squeezing the poor harder. It was a system designed to breed corruption, and it did. When you weren't collecting taxes, you were dealing with disputes that ranged from mundane to deadly. Someone's cow wandered onto someone else's land. Someone accused someone else of cheating at cards. Someone got into a fight at the saloon. Someone's been stealing lumber from the sawmill. These were your problems now. And how did you solve them? You had no training in law enforcement. You probably had no legal education. You had a badge and hopefully a gun you knew how to use. And that was it. You made it up as you went along, relying on common sense, community standards, and whatever the wealthy men who got you elected wanted you to do. Actual, serious crime, the kind that gets romanticized in westerns, was surprisingly rare in most frontier towns. Murders happened, yes, but not with the frequency Hollywood suggested. More common were property crimes, theft and fraud, and those were the crimes your backers cared about. When someone stole horses from a wealthy rancher, you were expected to form a posse and track them down. When someone robbed the general store, you investigated immediately. But when a poor miner got beaten and robbed, well, that probably wouldn't be a priority unless it attracted too much attention. Forming a posse was one of your main tools, and it reveals how tenuous your authority really was. You couldn't do this job alone. The territory was too large, the population too dispersed, your resources too limited. So when you needed help, you deputized civilians. Just regular men who you handed a temporary badge and asked to help you chase criminals or maintain order. These posses could be effective, or they could be disasters. Sometimes you'd deputize responsible citizens who took the job seriously. Sometimes you'd end up deputizing the same drunken troublemakers who caused problems the rest of the time, because they were the only ones willing to ride with you. And here's where it got messy. Once you deputized a posse, you had limited control over what they did. They were armed, they were often angry about whatever crime had been committed, and they weren't bound by the constraints that might have held back a professional law officer. Posses could quickly turn into lynch mobs. The line between pursuing a suspect and executing him without trial was thin and frequently crossed. You, as sheriff, were supposed to prevent that. But if the posse was made up of men who worked for your political backers, men who had their own grievances, how much control did you really have? Then there's the jurisdictional nightmare. You're a county sheriff, which means your authority extends throughout the county. But counties in frontier territories were enormous, sometimes thousands of square miles. You couldn't be everywhere. Meanwhile, towns within your county might have their own marshals, appointed or elected by the town council. These town marshals had authority within town limits, but so did you. Overlap and conflict were inevitable. You'd both claim jurisdiction over the same crime. You'd both want credit for the same arrest. Sometimes you'd even end up arresting each other's deputies in disputes that had more to do with politics than law. And above you in the hierarchy were US Marshals, appointed by the Attorney General to enforce federal law. They had authority anywhere in the territory, which meant they could ride into your county and take over cases. Sometimes they'd work with you. Sometimes they'd ignore you or actively undermine you. The relationship depended entirely on personalities and politics. There were famous cases of sheriffs and marshals arresting each other, both claiming legal authority, turning law enforcement into farce. Military authorities added another layer of confusion. Army officers at frontier forts had their own form of law enforcement, especially when Native Americans were involved. They could declare martial law, suspend civilian authority, arrest people on military grounds. If you were sheriff near a fort, you navigated this carefully, because the army had more men and more guns than you'd ever have. The violence you faced as sheriff was real and constant, not melodramatic showdowns at high noon, ambushes, shots in the back, men waiting for you in dark alleys or outside your home at night. The people you were trying to arrest knew you were coming and prepared accordingly. They had friends, they had allies, they had no interest in going to jail quietly, and in a society where everyone was armed, every arrest carried the potential for lethal violence. The death rate among frontier sheriffs was staggering. Many served only briefly before being killed. Some were shot by criminals they were trying to arrest. Some were killed by angry mobs when they tried to prevent lynchings. Some were murdered by political enemies who saw eliminating the sheriff as a way to seize power. Very few sheriffs served for years or decades like you see in the movies. Most lasted months. If you made it a full term without being killed or run out of town, you were lucky. And if the danger didn't get you, the politics would. Remember, you were elected, which meant you faced re-election, and your opponents would use any weapon to unseat you. They'd spread rumours about corruption, even if you were honest. They'd blame you for every crime that occurred, even if you'd done everything possible to prevent it. They'd accuse you of being too harsh or too lenient, depending on what served their interests. And your backers, the men who got you elected, would abandon you the moment you stopped being useful to them. Let's look at a real example. Consider James Butler, sheriff of a Kansas county in the 1870s. Butler was elected with the support of the local cattle barons, men who owned vast ranches and controlled the region's economy. His job was to protect their interests. When rustlers stole cattle, he pursued them aggressively. When cowboys from rival ranches fought in town, he arrested them selectively, going after the workers of ranches his backers considered enemies while letting the others go. When poor farmers complained about cattle trampling their crops, he did nothing because his backers were the cattle owners. Butler was actually pretty good at the parts of the job that mattered to his backers. He recovered stolen cattle. He kept rival ranchers in check. He collected taxes efficiently, pocketing his commission while making sure the county had enough money to fund infrastructure projects his backers wanted. By any objective measure, he was a successful sheriff. But he made a fatal mistake. He started to believe his own mythology. He started thinking his badge gave him real authority, independent of the men who'd put him in office. When a prominent rancher's son got drunk and killed a man in a barroom fight, Butler arrested him, locked him up, prepared to actually prosecute him. His backers were furious. They'd expected the usual treatment, a quiet conversation, maybe a fine, the whole thing swept under the rug. But Butler insisted on following the law. The rancher's son had killed someone in front of witnesses. There had to be consequences. Butler's backers tried to reason with him. Then they tried to bribe him. When he refused, they realized they had a problem. They'd elected a sheriff who thought he was actually in charge. The solution was brutal and efficient. Butler's opponents, funded by the same ranchers who'd originally supported him, started a campaign to recall him from office. They spread stories about his corruption, ironically accusing him of the very crimes they'd been committing with his help. They organized a vote. When the vote went against him, Butler had to choose, accept removal or fight. He tried to fight, claiming the recall was illegal. That's when things turned violent. One night, as Butler walked from the jail to his home, someone shot him from a rooftop. He survived, but barely. And he got the message. He resigned, left the county, and was never heard from again. The ranchers appointed a new sheriff, someone who understood the rules. The rancher's son who'd started all this trouble. He was quietly released and never faced trial. Justice, frontier style. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the pattern. Sheriffs who challenged the existing power structure didn't last. They were voted out, bought off, run out of town, or killed. The badge didn't confer independence. It was a tool, and like any tool, it served whoever wielded it. The wealthy business owners who controlled frontier economies also controlled their sheriffs, either through financial dependence, political pressure, or outright threats. Sometimes sheriffs themselves were part of the corruption. The most famous case is Henry Plummer in Montana, who we mentioned earlier. Whether Plummer was actually guilty of leading a gang of road agents is still debated by historians. But what's undeniable is that many frontier sheriffs did use their positions for criminal gain. They'd take bribes to look the other way when crimes were committed. They'd participate in land fraud, claim jumping, protection rackets. Some ran gambling operations or brothels on the side. A few were essentially gang leaders who wore badges as cover. This made sense from a certain twisted logic. The position of sheriff was dangerous and poorly paid. Why not supplement your income through less legitimate means? You already had authority and weapons. You could arrest your competitors, or anyone who threatened to expose you. You were, in theory, the embodiment of the law, which made you nearly untouchable as long as you didn't cross the truly powerful. And if you were eventually caught, well, you probably saw it coming and got out before consequences caught up with you. The limitations of frontier sheriffs weren't just about corruption or political control. It was also about practical reality. Even if you were honest and brave and genuinely committed to law enforcement, you couldn't be everywhere. Your county might cover thousands of square miles. You might be the only full-time law officer for all that territory. How do you patrol it? How do you even know when crimes are being committed in remote areas? You relied on people coming to you with complaints, and many people didn't bother because they knew you couldn't do anything meaningful. Criminals understood this. They knew that committing crimes far from town meant almost no chance of facing consequences. They knew that witnesses were scarce in empty country. They knew that by the time the sheriff heard about a crime and could organize a response, they'd be long gone. The frontier was simply too big, too empty, too anarchic for any single law officer to control. The mythology of the all-powerful sheriff, the man who single-handedly kept the peace, it was just that. Mythology. The reality was a lone man on a horse, underpaid and outgunned, trying to impose order on chaos and failing more often than he succeeded. But we haven't yet talked about the real power behind the frontier, the invisible hand that controlled not just individual towns but entire regions. The corporations and distant investors who saw the West not as a place to live but as a resource to exploit. These were the forces that dwarfed even the wealthiest local businessmen. Forces that could make or break entire communities with a single decision made 1,000 miles away. Let's meet the real rulers of the frontier, the ones you never saw but whose power shaped everything. Imagine you're looking at a frontier town from above, seeing it the way a hawk might see it as it circles on a thermal current. From this perspective, the town looks fragile and temporary, a few dozen buildings scattered across the landscape, dirt streets connecting them, people moving like ants, busy with their small concerns. But zoom out further, and you start to see the forces that really matter. The railroad line that determines whether this town will survive or vanish. The mining claim owned by a company headquartered in San Francisco that employs half the town's men. The land itself, much of it owned not by the people who work it, but by speculation syndicates operating out of Boston or New York. From this perspective, the town looks less like a community and more like a company asset, existing only as long as it serves someone else's profit margin. This is the truth about the American frontier that cuts deepest. All that rhetoric about independence and self-determination, all the mythology about rugged individualists taming the wilderness, it obscures the reality that most of the West was owned and controlled by Eastern and European capital from the very beginning. The people living there, the ones doing the actual work of mining or ranching or farming, they were just labor, expendable, replaceable, and the power brokers who determined their fates never set foot in these frontier towns. They sat in boardrooms and offices, making decisions based on profit and loss columns, and those decisions rippled outward with devastating effect. Let's start with the most obvious example, the railroads. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, but railroad construction continued throughout the West for decades after, and wherever the railroad went, power followed. Railroad companies didn't just lay track, they determined where towns would be built. They controlled land for miles on either side of the tracks, granted to them by the federal government in one of the greatest wealth transfers in American history. They decided which existing settlements would get stations and which would be bypassed, which was essentially a decision about which towns would survive and which would wither and die. Think about the power dynamic here. You're a settler who's established a homestead. You've built a cabin, cleared land, planted crops. You've invested years of your life into this place. Then the railroad comes through and its route is 10 miles from your property instead of right next to it. Suddenly your land is worthless. You're too far from the station to sell. Your goods easily. Your neighbors start moving to the new town that's springing up along the rail line. Within a year or two, you're living in isolation, your investment evaporated, and you had no say in this. The decision was made by engineers and executives you've never met, based on considerations that had nothing to do with you. Or maybe you're luckier. The railroad does come through your area. A station is built, a town forms, but the railroad company owns the town, not metaphorically, literally. They own the land the buildings sit on. They lease it to businessmen who want to open saloons or stores. They control who gets to build and where. They set the terms, and those terms heavily favour the railroad. This was called a railroad town, and many frontier communities started this way, as corporate assets rather than independent settlements. The railroad companies were among the largest corporations in America, some of the largest in the world. They had resources no frontier community could match. Private armies of security men, often Pinkerton detectives who'd enforce the company's will with violence. Legal departments that could tie up opponents in court for years. Political connections that reached to the highest levels of government. They weren't just businesses, they were powers unto themselves, quasi-governmental entities that answered to shareholders rather than citizens, and they used that power ruthlessly. When railroad workers tried to organize unions, demanding better pay or safer conditions, the companies broke the unions with hired thugs. When settlers tried to challenge land claims, the companies buried them in lawsuits. When towns tried to regulate railroad operations, maybe limiting speeds through residential areas or demanding better service, the companies threatened to pull out, which would kill the town's economy. It was corporate feudalism, and resistance was dangerous. The mining industry operated similarly. When gold or silver was discovered, individual prospectors might make the initial finds, but they rarely got to keep their wealth. Large mining companies, financed by Eastern or European capital, would move in. They'd buy up claims, sometimes fairly, often through fraud or intimidation. They'd bring in industrial equipment that individual miners couldn't afford. Within a few years, independent mining was dead, replaced by corporate operations that employed men as wage labourers. These mining companies created company towns that were nightmares of control. The company owned everything: the houses workers lived in, the stores where they bought supplies, even the money they were paid with. Scrip, it was called, company currency that could only be spent at company stores. This wasn't just about profit, though it was certainly that. Prices at company stores were inflated, so workers ended up owing the company more than they earned, trapped in a cycle of debt that was effectively slavery. But it was also about control. A worker who owed the company couldn't leave. A worker who depended on the company for housing and food couldn't strike. The company had total power over every aspect of workers' lives. Ludlow, Colorado, provides the most infamous example of corporate power in action. In 1914, coal miners went on strike, demanding better pay and working conditions. The mining company responded by evicting striking workers from company housing. The workers set up a tent colony and continued striking. The company hired private security, armed them, and told them to break the strike. What followed was a massacre. The security forces, backed by National Guard units that the company had essentially bought, attacked the tent colony. They fired machine guns into the tents. They set fires. When it was over, 20 people were dead, including women and children. The company faced no meaningful consequences. A few security men were charged with murder, but all were acquitted. The message was clear: corporate power trumped human rights, and resistance meant death. But Ludlow happened after the frontier period technically ended. During the actual frontier era, corporate violence was even more common because there were fewer restraints. In the 1870s and 1880s, mining and railroad companies routinely used violence against workers who challenged them. Strikes were broken with clubs and guns. Labour organisers were assassinated, their murders ruled accidents or blamed on other workers. Company security forces operated with absolute impunity, and local sheriffs, if they existed, were usually on the company payroll. Justice meant whatever protected corporate profits. Land speculation syndicates operated differently but with similar effect. Wealthy investors back east would pool resources to buy huge tracts of western land. Often, they bought it from the government at cheap prices, taking advantage of laws designed to encourage settlement. Then they'd hold it, waiting for the land's value to increase, or they'd lease it to ranchers or farmers, collecting rent while doing none of the work. Or they'd subdivide it and sell it at inflated prices to settlers who didn't realize they were paying 10 times what the land was worth. These speculators never saw the land they owned. It was just an investment, a line on a ledger. But their ownership had real effects. Settlers who thought they'd staked valid claims would suddenly discover their land was actually owned by a syndicate in Philadelphia. They'd be forced to either buy the land at prices they couldn't afford or leave. Ranchers who'd been grazing cattle on open range would find that range suddenly enclosed by new landowners who charged fees for access. Communities that had organized themselves around common land use patterns would see those patterns shattered by absentee owners who didn't care about local needs. The federal government itself was a massive landowner, of course, but government land was supposed to be available for homesteading, except it wasn't really. The Homestead Act of 1862 promised 160 acres to anyone who'd settle and farm it for 5 years. Sounds generous, but in practice, much of that land ended up in corporate hands through fraud and manipulation. Employees of railroad and mining companies would file homestead claims, fulfill the minimum requirements, then immediately transfer the land to their employers. Speculators would hire dummy claimants to do the same. The government land office was understaffed and corrupt, often looking the other way when obvious fraud occurred. So the promise of free land for settlers became a mechanism for corporate land grabbing. Telegraph lines connected frontier towns to the rest of the country, which sounds like progress. And it was, in some ways. Information could flow faster. Orders for goods could be placed and received. News from back east took days instead of weeks. But the telegraph also meant that distant owners could exert control with unprecedented speed. A decision made in a New York boardroom could be transmitted to a Colorado mining town within hours. Fire the workforce, change production quotas, shut down operations. The men living in those towns, whose livelihoods depended on the mines or the railroad, had no warning and no recourse. They'd show up for work and find the gates locked, and that was that. Bank loans were another form of distant control. Frontier businesses and ranches needed capital, and that capital came from banks back east. Those banks charged high interest rates, justified by the risk of lending in unstable territories. But the rates were often usurious, designed to generate profit for the bank while making it nearly impossible for borrowers to escape debt. When a ranch or business defaulted, the bank would seize the assets. Often the bank wouldn't even keep the property. They'd sell it to other investors, continuing the cycle of absentee ownership. The people who'd built something from nothing would lose it to people who'd never seen it, never worked it, never cared about it as anything but a number on a balance sheet. And here's the darkest irony. The frontier mythology celebrates independence and self-determination. The lone cowboy, the self-made man, the pioneer family carving out a life through hard work and determination. But the reality was that the frontier was one of the least independent places in America. Almost everyone was dependent on distant capital, distant decisions, distant power. The freedom that supposedly defined frontier life was mostly an illusion. You were free to work yourself to death on land you didn't own, extracting resources for companies that paid you barely enough to survive. And if you complained or organized or challenged the system, well, there were always consequences. Women on the frontier experienced this power dynamic differently, but no less intensely. The mythology usually casts women as civilizing influences, domesticators who brought morality and order to wild spaces. Or they're invisible, relegated to the background while men had adventures. But the reality was far more complex. Some women wielded significant power. Some were victims of systems that left them few choices. Some were both. Let's look at how gender intersected with power on the frontier, because these stories reveal a lot about how systems of control actually function. First, let's talk about the women who held real economic power. They were rare, but they existed. Madams who ran brothels could accumulate substantial wealth and influence. Brothels were businesses, often quite profitable. They catered to a population that was overwhelmingly male, starved for female company or at least the simulacrum of it, and willing to pay significantly for the privilege. A successful madam controlled valuable real estate, employed multiple women, and often had connections to every powerful man in town. Those connections gave her leverage. She knew secrets, she knew weaknesses, and she could use that knowledge to protect her business or advance her interests. Some madams became political power brokers. They'd fund candidates, usually discreetly. They'd encourage their employees and customers to vote certain ways. They'd trade favors, using their position as confidants to wealthy men to negotiate deals or settle disputes. They were, in their own way, as powerful as saloon keepers, operating in a parallel economy based on vice and vice's profitability. Society ostracized them, officially at least. Respectable women wouldn't associate with them. Churches condemned them. But everyone knew that behind closed doors, the most prominent men in town were their customers. Hypocrisy was just another tool in the frontier power game. Consider Laura Bullion, known as Big Nose Kate, though that wasn't actually her profession. She was associated with Doc Holliday and the Earp Circle. But there were women like Mattie Silks in Denver who ran extensive operations, competing with other madams for control of the market. Silks was known for getting into an actual duel with another madam, reportedly the only recorded duel between women in Western history. She survived, maintained her business for decades, and died wealthy, having outlasted most of the men who'd tried to control or eliminate her. Female saloon owners existed too, though they were extremely rare. Running a saloon required capital, connections, and a willingness to operate in a male-dominated, often violent environment. Women who succeeded usually had backing from men, either partners or deceased husbands, whose businesses they'd inherited. But once established, some of these women proved just as ruthless as their male counterparts. They extended credit, called in debts, hired muscle, settled disputes. Gender didn't exempt them from the brutal economics of frontier business. If anything, it made those economics more complicated, as they had to navigate not just economic competition but also social prejudices that saw female business owners as aberrations. Then there were women landowners, widows typically, who found themselves controlling property after their husbands died. Frontier life was dangerous. Men died from accidents, disease, violence. Their widows inherited ranches, mining claims, businesses. Some remarried quickly, seeking the protection and labor a husband provided. But others chose to run things themselves, and some were surprisingly successful. They hired workers. They made business decisions. They defended their property against claim jumpers and rivals. They operated in a world that officially didn't believe women could or should do these things, which actually gave them some advantages. Competitors underestimated them. Officials didn't take them seriously. And while that disrespect must have been infuriating, it also created opportunities for women who were smart enough to exploit it. But these women with power were exceptions. For most women on the frontier, life was defined by dependence and vulnerability. Women had few legal rights. Married women couldn't own property in their own names in most territories. They couldn't enter into contracts. Their husbands controlled their earnings if they worked outside the home. Divorce was nearly impossible and socially devastating. This legal structure ensured that most women were completely dependent on men, fathers or husbands, for economic survival. And that dependence was dangerous. Frontier society was violent, and women bore much of that violence. Domestic abuse was common and largely ignored. A man could beat his wife with little fear of consequences. If she tried to leave, where would she go? She had no money, no legal rights to property or children, no profession that would support her. The few places that might take her in, like brothels, came with their own forms of exploitation. So women stayed, endured, and hoped they'd survive. Prostitution itself is a complicated topic that reveals the intersections of gender, economics, and power. Some women chose prostitution, seeing it as their best economic option, in a place where respectable work for women barely paid enough to survive. Teaching, one of the few acceptable professions, paid very poorly. Domestic service was available but came with its own vulnerabilities. Prostitution, for all its dangers and social stigma, at least offered the possibility of making decent money. Some women who worked as prostitutes managed to save enough to eventually leave the profession, establishing themselves as respectable businesswomen or marrying into better circumstances. But many, probably most, Women in prostitution were there because they had no choice. They'd been trafficked, which absolutely happened on the frontier despite the mythology of voluntary vice. They'd been forced into it by poverty, by predatory men who posed as protectors but were really pimps, by circumstances that left them with no other options. They worked in conditions that ranged from merely exploitative to absolutely horrific. Disease was rampant. Violence from customers was common. Opium and alcohol addiction were almost inevitable, the only ways to endure the work. And most women in prostitution died young, from disease or violence or suicide, or the cumulative effects of a life that ground them down to nothing. The mythology celebrates certain women, school teachers who brought civilization to the wilderness, pioneer wives who stood by their men through hardship. And yes, those women existed, and their work mattered. Teaching was crucial for establishing permanent communities. Women's labour, cooking and cleaning and raising children and managing household economies, was essential for settlement to succeed. But celebrating these women often means ignoring their lack of choices, the way social structures force them into narrow roles, and then praise them for accepting those roles. Women couldn't vote in most frontier territories, which meant they had no formal political power. They couldn't serve on juries. They couldn't run for office. The governance of frontier society was entirely male, and that governance reflected male priorities and interests. Women's concerns, their safety, their rights, their needs, were secondary at best. Laws about rape and assault were rarely enforced when the victim was a woman, especially a woman without powerful male protectors. Property crimes were taken more seriously than crimes against women, which tells you everything about where the power was and whose interests it served. But women found ways to exercise informal power. They formed social networks that governed community morality and reputation. They organized churches and schools, creating institutions that lasted longer than many frontier businesses. They sometimes used their position as moral arbiters to pressure men into better behavior, shaming men who were too drunk or violent or neglectful. They supported each other through childbirth and illness and loss, building systems of mutual aid that governments and businesses didn't provide. And occasionally, women participated in vigilante violence themselves. Not often, but it happened. Women joined mobs that ran prostitutes out of town, once communities decided they wanted to be respectable. Women participated in racial violence, targeting Chinese or Mexican families. Women attended lynchings, watching men hang, sometimes bringing their children. The frontier didn't make women inherently civilizing or moral. It revealed that women, like men, were capable of cruelty when it served their interests, or when social pressure encouraged it. Power and its abuses weren't just male domains. Race and power on the frontier is another area where mythology and reality diverge sharply. The Western movies show white cowboys and settlers as the protagonists, with Native Americans as either noble savages or savage savages depending on the film's politics, and everyone else mostly invisible. But the real frontier was far more diverse, and that diversity was managed through brutal systems of racial hierarchy that served economic interests. Let's start with Mexican and Mexican-American communities, because their dispossession is one of the frontier's great crimes. Before American expansion, much of the West was Mexican territory. Mexican families owned vast ranches under land grants dating back to Spanish colonial times. These grants were supposed to be honored under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo when Mexico ceded the territory. But in practice, American settlers and speculators used every tool available to steal that land. They challenged land grants in court, forcing Mexican owners to spend years and fortunes defending their titles. American courts, staffed by American judges and operating under American law, usually found in favor of American claimants. They used violence and intimidation, burning Mexican families out, killing resistors, making it clear that holding onto land meant risking your life. They manipulated property taxes, assessing Mexican-owned land at high values, then waiting for owners to default before buying it for pennies on the dollar. Within a generation, land that had been Mexican for centuries was almost entirely in Anglo hands. This wasn't just economic, it was racial. Mexicans and Mexican-Americans were seen as racially inferior by most white settlers, which justified dispossessing them. The same logic that justified taking land from Native Americans was applied to Hispanic landowners, an assumption that white Americans had a superior claim to the continent. and this ideology was backed by violence that was pervasive and often organized. Vigilante groups specifically targeted Hispanic families. Lynchings of Mexicans were common in Texas and California, and these lynchings were often about property rather than any actual crime. Drive away the Mexican families, and their land becomes available. Chinese immigrants faced different but equally brutal treatment. They came to California and other western states during the gold rush, and afterward, seeking economic opportunity. Some were merchants who established successful businesses. Many were laborers who worked mines or helped build the Transcontinental Railroad, and they were hated for it, blamed for taking jobs from white workers, accused of driving down wages through their willingness to work for less. This hatred was really about economic competition, but it was expressed through racial violence. Anti-Chinese riots erupted periodically in frontier towns. White mobs would descend on Chinese neighborhoods, beating residents, destroying property, sometimes killing people. The Rock Springs Massacre in Wyoming in 1885 killed at least 28 Chinese miners and drove hundreds more out of town. The cause was economic. Chinese miners were working claims that white miners wanted. The solution was racial violence, and local and federal authorities did almost nothing to stop it or punish those responsible. Many frontier towns passed ordinances explicitly designed to drive out Chinese residents. Laundry laws that made it impossible to operate traditional Chinese businesses. Queue ordinances that forced Chinese men to cut their hair, violating cultural practices. Special taxes on Chinese businesses and residents. These laws were nakedly discriminatory, and everyone knew it. But they were popular with white voters who saw Chinese immigrants as threats, so politicians eagerly passed them. Chinese merchant associations formed their own governance structures, creating shadow institutions that provided security, settled disputes, and protected community members. They had to, because official institutions offered no protection. When a Chinese resident was robbed or assaulted or killed, authorities rarely investigated. The message was clear: you're not protected here. You're not wanted. Survive however you can, but expect no help from us. Black cowboys, settlers, and soldiers also faced pervasive racism. The mythology of the cowboy is white, but historians estimate that roughly a quarter of cowboys were black, many of them former slaves who'd headed west after the Civil War, seeking freedom and opportunity that southern states denied them. They worked cattle drives, managed ranches, developed reputations as skilled horsemen and ropers. But they were paid less than white cowboys. They were denied leadership positions. They faced constant indignities and violence. Some black cowboys achieved prominence, like Nat Love, who became famous under the name Deadwood Dick. But most labored in obscurity, their contributions erased from the historical record. Black settlers who tried to establish homesteads faced organized campaigns to drive them away. White neighbors would refuse to help during emergencies, a death sentence in frontier environments. Vigilantes would burn black-owned farms. Local merchants would refuse service. And if black communities managed to establish themselves anyway, organizing towns or settlements that were relatively prosperous, white violence would escalate until the communities were destroyed. The Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921 is the most famous example, but there were dozens of similar attacks on black frontier communities, most of them forgotten. Native Americans, of course, faced genocide, but that's a topic too large and too awful to fully explore tonight. We'll just note that the frontier's expansion meant the systematic destruction of native societies, the theft of all their land, and the murder or forced removal of populations that had lived there for millennia. Every frontier town was built on stolen land, and the theft was still ongoing. The US Army conducted campaigns of extermination, killing native people, destroying their food sources, forcing survivors onto reservations where conditions were deliberately kept miserable. Settlers who objected were rare. Most either participated enthusiastically or just didn't care. The frontier was whites' only space, and making it so required violence that approached the scale of genocide. These racial hierarchies weren't separate from economic power structures. They were integral to them. Dispossessing Native Americans and Mexicans made land available for white settlers and corporations. Excluding Chinese workers from certain industries protected white workers' wages and opportunities. Keeping black residents subordinate ensured a labour force that could be exploited without meaningful resistance. Race and class intersected in ways that reinforced both forms of hierarchy, creating systems of control that benefited wealthy white men most of all, but threw enough scraps to poor white men to keep them invested in the system. Eventually the frontier ended, or at least that's the official story. In 1890, the Census Bureau announced that the frontier line, the boundary between settled and unsettled territory, no longer existed. Settlement had spread enough that you couldn't draw a clear line anymore. Historians mark this as the end of the frontier era. But what really ended wasn't expansion or settlement. It was a particular kind of chaos, a particular constellation of power relationships. The transition from frontier to settled society didn't mean power became more democratic or justice more fair. It meant power consolidated, became more organized, took on forms that looked more legitimate but served the same interests. What changed? Federal authority finally arrived in force. Territories became states, with functioning court systems and established law enforcement. The violence that had defined frontier justice became less acceptable, or at least less visible. Vigilante committees were disbanded or prosecuted. Sheriffs became more professional, less beholden to local business interests, though never fully independent. The rule of law, actual law, rather than whoever had the most guns, slowly established itself. But this transition didn't happen because people decided to be more civilized. It happened because stability became more profitable than chaos. Railroads needed predictable conditions to operate efficiently. Mining companies wanted enforceable contracts and property rights. Banks needed stable governance to secure their investments. Once the frontier's resources had been claimed and organized, once the land had been distributed and the economic structures established, chaos was no longer useful. Order became the priority, but order designed to protect the interests of those who'd already seized power during the chaotic period. Many of the most violent, predatory men from the frontier era transformed themselves into respectable citizens. The saloon keeper who'd extended credit at usurious rates and called in debts with violence became a banker. The vigilante who'd participated in lynchings became a politician. The claim jumper who'd stolen land became a rancher whose children would be pillars of the community. This transformation was facilitated by selective memory and deliberate myth-making. People wanted to believe they'd been heroes, not criminals. So they rewrote their own histories, emphasizing the dangerous conditions they'd faced, the order they'd brought, the civilization they'd built. The violence and theft that actually happened got downplayed or justified as necessary, unfortunate but inevitable consequences of expansion. Some people didn't get to make this transformation. The working class men who'd been muscle for vigilante committees, who'd done the actual killing on behalf of their employers, they couldn't reinvent themselves. They were too marked by violence, too openly criminal. They often ended up dead or in prison or drifting to new frontiers where chaos still reigned. The women who'd worked in prostitution rarely managed to achieve respectability, dying young or living in poverty on society's margins. People of colour, regardless of what they'd achieved or survived, remained locked out of power by racial hierarchies that persisted long after the frontier officially closed. The mythology that emerged about the frontier served important purposes. It justified expansion by casting it as heroic. It obscured the role of corporations and distant capital by emphasizing individual pioneers. It romanticized violence by framing it as necessary and brave. And perhaps most importantly, it created a national origin story that Americans could feel good about. A story of freedom and self-determination, an opportunity that glossed over the theft, exploitation, and systematic violence that actually characterized the era. This mythology influenced American culture profoundly. The cowboy became a national icon, symbolizing independence and masculinity. Frontier narratives shaped how Americans understood themselves and their country, and the power structures established on the frontier, the dominance of corporate interests, the weakness of democratic governance, the casual use of violence to protect property, these didn't disappear. They evolved, became institutionalized, persisted in forms that still shape American society today. Company towns didn't vanish, they just became less obvious. corporations still control entire communities, just through more indirect mechanisms. Private law enforcement still exists. Security companies that serve corporate interests. Vigilante justice still happens, though we call it other things now. Stand your ground laws and citizens' arrests and militias. The frontier didn't end, it just got sanitized and rebranded. And here's what the frontier teaches us, what makes this history uncomfortable but necessary to understand. Power doesn't require legitimacy. It doesn't need to be earned or justified. Power just is, held by whoever has the resources to seize it and the will to maintain it. The frontier was supposed to be a place where people could escape the corruptions and hierarchies of settled society. Instead, it became a laboratory for understanding how quickly new hierarchies form, how naturally violence becomes a tool of governance, how easily economic power translates into every other kind of power. The men with badges, the official representatives of law and order, they were never really in charge. They were employees, tools used by others. Real power lay with the people who controlled resources, who extended credit, who hired the muscle, who made the decisions about where railroads would run and which towns would survive. That power was often invisible, operating through proxies, exercised from boardrooms and offices far from the dusty streets where its effects were felt. We tell ourselves stories about the frontier because those stories are comforting. We want to believe in the noble sheriff, the democratic town meeting, the rough justice that was nevertheless justice. But those stories are lies we tell to avoid confronting what the frontier really reveals about power, about human nature, about what happens when you strip away the institutions and norms that constrain our worst impulses. The frontier wasn't a place of freedom. It was a place where the powerful did what they wanted, and the powerless suffered, and the mythology that emerged later tried to make that seem heroic. So who really ruled the towns and cities of frontier America? Not the sheriffs, not the mayors or councils or judges, not even, primarily, the local businessmen, though they mattered. The frontier was ruled by distant capital, by corporate power that saw the West as resources to extract and populations to exploit. It was ruled by whoever could marshal violence most effectively, whether through hired guns or vigilante committees, or the implicit threat that came with economic control. It was ruled by men who understood that in a place without functioning law, morality is whatever serves your interests, and justice is whatever you can enforce. That's the truth about frontier America. Not pretty, not uplifting, not the story you got from John Wayne movies, but it's the story that actually happened. And maybe, as you drift off to sleep tonight, let that settle in your mind, not to make you cynical or despairing, but to make you understand how power really works, how systems of control establish themselves, how quickly chaos gives way to hierarchy. The frontier ended more than a century ago, but its lessons remain relevant, because power still concentrates, violence still protects property, distant interests still control local lives. The frontier's brutality was just more honest about it. So that's our journey for tonight. From the saloon keepers who ruled through vice and credit, to the store owners who controlled necessities, to the vigilantes who enforced the will of the wealthy, to the sheriffs who discovered their badges meant nothing, to the invisible corporations that owned everything and everyone. From the mythology of frontier, justice to the reality of frontier power. From the comfortable lies we tell ourselves to the uncomfortable truths we'd rather forget. If you made it this far, if you learned something that disturbed or enlightened you, go ahead and hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into the histories we don't usually examine closely, and drop your city and the time in the comments. I love seeing where you all are, whether you're still awake or whether this story carried you off to sleep somewhere along the way. Next time, we'll explore another chapter of history that's darker and more complicated than the stories would have you believe. But for now, let your breathing slow, let your mind settle. Let the harsh realities of the frontier fade into the background as you drift into sleep. The West was wild, but you're safe here in the present. Close your eyes. Rest well. Good night.